When both of you think about StrengthsFinder and even your own strengths, how have you seen even this assessment help build team culture?
God made everybody unique and with specific gifts, and for a reason. We need each other. Talking about the body of Christ, we don't all need to be noses or ears.
Right.
It's different. We need each other. We can appreciate that and then perform at our best, creating that culture.
Being at other higher education institutions and even other corporate settings, like you said earlier, Tori, it's giving people language.
Yeah.
Instead of labeling people, instead of going to the worst aspect or the weaknesses, let's talk about strengths.
Yeah.
Because people want to rally behind that. They want to show off what they're really good at. And so if you can help give people that language and then see where different people fit in the team, it helps them. It's like, oh, I can be really successful here. Here's where I can have a great impact.
Well, welcome to another episode of BeyondU. I'm excited for the conversation today. Tori, always great to see you. Thanks for being on today.
Excited about today's conversation.
Be fun. So I know one of the things that you and I talk about, we talked with Jim about this recently, is how important the whole idea of mission is to OCWU. It's kind of our what. Like, we are about equipping and sending students out on mission. But today, I think one of the things we'll do is talk about how we do that, right? So one of the things I love about what we do at OCWU is we use an assessment called the StrengthsFinder.
It's a great tool.
Yeah, a lot of people may be aware of it. If you're not, you should check it out. But it really helps students, because every freshman takes it, to understand how God has equipped them to be sent, right? Because that's part of the beauty of the body of Christ, is we're different, but we're all on the same team, so to speak. And so this is an assessment that we use for students. We have several staff and faculty that have taken it as well, that really gets into the how, right? So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Pumped for this conversation.
Yeah, for sure.
And so with that, let me welcome our guests today. We've got Stacey Duke with us and Aaron Bunker, both of them who work on campus here. And we're going to be talking a little bit just about the assessment and understanding what that is for you and for our listeners, for them as well, to understand more about that. We'll talk more about kind of team building using the StrengthsFinder and some culture building things. And then, as we love to do in this podcast, we'll talk about leadership and how this can be such a great resource for people who are in leadership or management or, some of those roles, and how this assessment could be helpful. We'll get a little bit more into the details of the assessment itself here in just a few minutes. But let's just start with you, Aaron. Tell us about yourself, your role here at OCWU, right? And then here in a couple minutes, we'll talk about your top 5 strengths and get into that a little bit. But just tell us a little bit initially about what you do.
Yeah. Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Tori. Thanks for having us. This is going to be awesome. So I serve as director of Path Development. So working in student development, basically get the privilege of helping students connect to the campus community, helping them discover and develop what they naturally do well, and just getting to be a fly on the wall, so to speak, and to be a part of their life and help encourage them to kind of discover what does it mean to be a successful college student, helping them navigate those ins and outs. And so it's a fun time. Spend a lot of time with our student leaders as well as our camp teams that we send out to camps in the summertime.
One of the things we've talked about, and Tori, we've talked with you about this, that we've talked about Path here at OCWU before, right? Because one of the things we're passionate about is not just helping students to walk across the graduation stage and get a degree, but can we give them the tools and the things here that not just at graduation, but in 10 years they can lean on, right? So that's part of what, and you do that really, really well, Aaron. Yeah. Stacey, how about you? Tell us a little bit about what you do.
So my main role is I'm the assistant dean of the College of Business, which most of the graduate programs I work with our doctoral students, our master's students, and I teach our undergrad program. So I get all of the students from beginning to end. In the journey and the life cycle. And we really try to embed them, enhance them, and enrich their strengths and help them on their path towards a successful future and a career.
That's fantastic. So let's do this for a couple minutes. I'm going to just kind of give a brief synopsis about what the assessment is in 90 seconds or so, and then we'll get into you all and talk about culture building a little bit. Tori, you're aware of your strengths too, so we'll pull that into this. Yeah, mostly. So when we think about psychology, right, a lot of what we tend to gravitate towards is this idea of looking at what's wrong with people. So we are always aware, and all of us, we have this voice in our head, right? And it's not positive for the most part. We always have this voice that's reminding us of our faults, our flaws. But several years ago, a researcher, Clifton, said, look, instead of looking at what's wrong with people, why don't we look at what's right with people? And his foresight to say, look, if we can help people to look at what's right with them and invest in that, and if, yes, work on the weaknesses and be aware of the blind spots, but people are much more satisfied by learning more about what's right with them than what's wrong with them, right? So he then did a lot of research and developed this assessment called the StrengthsFinder in its current form, with the Clifton StrengthsFinder, that each individual takes it, and it gives you a report of 34 strengths, okay? And we'll talk about domains a little bit later. And each person initially gets a top 5 report, right? That gives you your top 5 out of those 34 that give you a picture of really the way that God has wired you to lead. One of the fascinating things, and Tori, I don't think I've told you this, but the StrengthsFinder's done the research, Clifton has done, or Gallup, that the chances of somebody having the same top 5 in order, any guess what it is?
Oh, it's got to be like 1 in millions.
It's like 1 in 33 million people,
my goodness.
right? And that's part of what I love that dovetails so well with what we focus on here on mission and spiritual gifts and things like that, is it helps students and people to understand, okay, these are my unique strengths and gifts, right? So that's kind of the assessment in a nutshell. It helps people to understand what's right with you. And so then what we do is to come alongside students and faculty and say, this is how God has wired you. How can you be the best version of you with the Lord's help to make a difference for the kingdom using these strengths?
And you early on, and even our working relationship here at Oakwood helped me kind of put language to this by saying StrengthsFinder is a tool that gives us language to understand ourselves, and how many of us walk through life just kind of wondering, like, who am I? And StrengthsFinder is one of those things that can kind of help us figure that out. And we get to do that with students. Like, how cool is that? Yeah. That's wild.
Well, and part of the fun of it is you'll see StrengthsFinder carry over into your personal relationship, if you're married with your spouse or in parenting. So it's just, you carry these tools with you wherever you go, which is really, really fun to see, right? So Stacey and Aaron, Stacey, I'm going to start with you. So you've got your top 5 report, right? These things, these are the kind of the tools that the Lord has given you to lead. So if you can just give us your top 5 strengths and one that you're really leaning on right now with everything you got going on in the College of Business. Give us your top 5 and then one that you're leaning on, and then Aaron, we'll let you follow up with that.
Okay, so which is great in being in education. I start with learner, learner, achiever. I like to achieve goals. I have a high responsibility, connectedness of really connecting people and ideas. And then the one I most lean on is strategic. Okay. So my brain fits a bit like Tetris. Where do things fit? And when I'm really busy, it comes in hand because I can see what are all the moving parts and people and things that have to get done and how do I achieve those goals. And so I lean into that strength very heavily all the time, but specifically when it's hard pressed into the semester, everything happening.
Is the season.
Yeah, strategic gives you the capacity, kind of structured flexibility, right? It gives, you know where things are going, but as things shift around, you can adapt and flex. And like you said, that Tetris analogy makes sense. Yeah, I love that. Yeah, Aaron, how about for you?
Yeah, my top 5 lead with empathy, harmony, consistency, developer, and belief. So I'd say most of the time it's empathy, being able to kind of sense what people are going through and to kind of help put myself in their situation to kind of see where they're coming from to best help them and to best just even being a listening ear. So kind of lean heavy on that. A lot highly relational.
Yeah, I think one, and because you and I work together, right? Aaron has an amazing ability to read the room. He just can step in and kind of sense where people are, and that's that empathy and action, which is really, really great. Yeah,
it's so cool to hear people's top 5.
I know,
because like people just work with each other and you see each other, but then you put words to it. Again, that language, and you're like, yep. Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
And not to detour too much, we were actually talking in pre-production a little bit about so the 4 of us here share responsibility, and it might look different, but we all, and I see that in each of us, we all have that responsibility. It means that if we say yes to something, we're going to do it, and if that means staying late, or if that means it costs us something, right? So. All 4 of us do that in different ways, but that's kind of part of our leadership DNA is that responsibility.
What are your top 5, Ben?
I was going to ask you. I'll start.
Okay, you go first.
Okay, so my top 5 are intellection. My wife calls it my nerd strength. So intellection, input.
Okay.
Connectedness. Stacey, you and I share that one. So intellection, input, connectedness, belief, and harmony. Right. So for me, I think one that I'm really leaning on right now is my connectedness strength. So I teach as an adjunct here at Oakwood. I teach sociology. And I've got students in my classroom from around the world. And Stacey, you and I talked about this not long ago, but to build a classroom environment where even though we come from different parts, different socioeconomic backgrounds, different racial and ethnic backgrounds, that we can still find commonality as human beings, and to facilitate a learning environment around that,
Yeah.
I love it.
That's
I love
awesome.
It. Yeah.
I see
So
that
how about
here.
you?
Yeah, my top 5 are analytical, responsibility, strategic, relator, and deliberative. And I feel like maybe it's just the season I'm in, but every day I lean on a different one. But like Stacey, I would say I lean on strategic more often than not. Just it kind of helps cut through the chaos and the clutter of each day and help me figure out what to focus on and how to lead. So
Strategic is one that I'm most envious of. So I may need to borrow that from you.
We'll share, right?
yeah, there we go. We got enough to share at this table. So I'm curious, like when both of you think about StrengthsFinder and even your own strengths and even your own leadership background, how have you seen even this assessment help build team culture?
You want to start, Stacey? Because I know you got experience. You've been at Oakwood for just a little bit now. But
That sounds great. Yes, I'm finishing up my first academic year. And so being at other higher education institutions and even other corporate settings, like you said earlier, Tori, it's giving people language.
Yeah.
So how do we communicate instead of labeling people, instead of going to the worst aspect or the weaknesses? Let's talk about strengths.
Yeah.
Because people want to rally behind that. They want to show off what they're really good at. And so if you can help give people that language and then see where different people fit on the bus and the boat, whatever analogy you want to use, in the team, it helps them. It's like, oh, I can be really successful here. Here's where I can have a great impact. And even for myself, having the language took me from being somewhat successful to being far more successful than I thought possible because I knew the words. I knew what to lean into. I knew the types of jobs to apply for because I could lean into those strengths.
So would you say then, just to piggyback on that question for a minute, that part of the value of this in culture building is for each individual employee to feel like they're seen for the uniqueness, right? That's kind of what I hear you saying.
Yes,
is
absolutely.
You've got language to say, look, I can see your top 5, and Stacey, I see that in you, and Aaron and Tori, I see that in you. That it gives language for appreciating or recognizing what makes each person unique on a team.
Absolutely. If you look around our culture now, people are trying to find ways to fit. Where do I fit? And they don't always have the language for that or even to communicate what that is. So if we begin to build confidence and language around this is where you fit, this is how you can be successful, again, back to our students, we're giving them tools. It's a toolkit. But I love the way you said it's a part of our DNA. It's how God has made us. And so then you start to build your faith around this language and help. This is what I see as part of God in you.
Yeah, that's great. So Aaron, you work with our students and camp teams and things like that we send out every summer. Same question, just when you think about culture, how has StrengthsFinder helped you in some of the culture that you're building?
Yeah, I think piggybacking too on what Stacey mentioned too, it's helping students lean into what they do well naturally. And when you have confidence in who God has made you, then you can be confident in that, and you don't have to compare yourself to somebody else because you can appreciate who they are versus be jealous of instead of that. And so it's like, oh, I'm highly relational, okay, leaning into that, or I have more strategic thinking strength, I can lean into that, or executing. Just helps that, as they said, that common language, and to be able to appreciate, and then you can help a team maximize what they do well, and then also be aware of potential blind spots. But how do you use your strengths to be mindful of that, to appreciate what you do well? Because human nature says, "Oh, I wish I had this strength, or I wish I was more like them." When God made everybody unique and with specific gifts, and for a reason. We need each other. Talking about the body of Christ, we don't all need to be noses or ears.
Right.
You need each other. And similar to like strengths, how you do something, it's different. We need each other. We can appreciate that and then perform at our best, creating that culture.
But I think, Tori, you and I have talked about this in most of our leadership capacities, because you've taken over Chapel, which I did before you, right? And part of the benefit is, and I've told people this, I have no problem saying, is that you are so much better at it than I am, right? And part of that's just the way that you're wired, part of that's your gifting, but that strengths gives us language that I can recognize that you lead differently than I do, and I lead differently than you. And it's not better necessarily, but it's just different. Exactly. Yeah.
And to be able to see the beauty in that and not be trapped in this bondage of comparison, right? Like culture is especially with social media being as prevalent as it is, we're always caught in this comparison trap. And so strengths really frees us from that. Bunker, I think you talked a little bit about some of those blind spots and how it helps us have a way to maybe see around those. And so talk to us, both of us, a little bit from your perspective and your experience with strengths. Like how does StrengthsFinder help us understand our blind spots?
Yeah. So when you look at what you do naturally do well, so for example, when we just we're training, going through camp team training right now with our students that are going to be camp counselors this summer to represent Oakwood, which I love that, and getting able to see them being able to represent Christ in that way. But you give them a list of what they do well with their strengths, but their first thing that as they notice is what they don't have. Like, I wish I don't, or we're missing this strength versus, no, focusing on what you do well. If your team is highly relational, lean into that.
Yeah.
Focus on that. And then, how do you, we were talking before we started, Stacey and I, that her, number one is achiever. That's my number 34, very, very bottom. And so, but I have responsibility. So responsibility looks like outward motivation, and achiever looks like inward motivation. So I can get things done. I can play that card to look like achiever, because I don't want to let a team down. I want to be able to achieve. So similar in those senses, helping students, if they're highly executing or highly strategic thinking, okay, how can you leverage that so that you can be confident in who you are instead of being jealous of who you're not, or that comparison.
Leverage is the right language there, right? Because it really is kind of that
absolutely.
fulcrum. How about you, Stacey? Like when you think about this assessment with blind spots and how it helps us identify those, what's your take on that?
I love it when we're working in a team setting, especially in a department of business or any kind of college setting, is you start to see, as you said, where those blind spots are. So how do we help one another? And I had a conversation with my supervisor even today, and I was like, you're really good at this, and I'm really good at this. So this is how we work together for maximum, like you said, success. And we're both really happy that we get to the main goal and we get to achieve things, but sometimes it looks different for different people. And so, but being able to see those blind spots and speak to that in love and in charity and with graciousness, and to forgive one another when we kind of rub each other, and that's just because we're people.
Right.
And so sometimes I wish I had different strengths. And how do I get that strength? Where responsibility, because there's a burden to it. And some people say there's a shadow side to our strengths, not just a blind spot. There's shadow sides to what helps us exceed, can also kind of sometimes become a burden.
Yeah.
And so
That's a good way of looking at it.
I think that's a great way. And I think that's kind of to take the conversation a further step, that a lot of times what I see is your strengths do have a shadow side. That sometimes can become a blind spot, so to speak, right? So I know for me, the harmony strength, at least I think I'm fairly easy to get along with.
You are.
Some people would disagree, maybe. But the shadow side that I have to be aware of is if I'm into self-protection, that means I don't want to confront things that I need to confront, right? And so that's kind of a blind spot or a shadow side that I have to be aware of with my strengths is I can find common ground, but I also have to recognize that sometimes things need to be confronted and I need to do it, right? Whether I'm comfortable or not. And that's part of just that awareness. So let's kind of go a level further. So we've talked about the assessment. It gives you, there's 1 to 34, these 34 strengths. Each person who takes it gets a personalized report, which is fantastic, by the way. But one of the things that Don Clifton did to take it further is these strengths are then grouped into what he called domains. So there are 4 strengths domains. So you have your executors, right? And these are the people who get things done. They're the people who like the tasks and checking things off the list that kind of propel us forward. You have your influencing strengths, which a lot of times in a very positive way, I see personality traits. These are people who are really good in front of people, a lot of times great at sales and more of that side of things. You have your relationship builders, which are the people who are always checking on the team. How are we doing? How are you doing? Right? That's Aaron that we're talking about. And then you have your strategic thinkers, okay? The people who think, they plan, they vision cast, they research, they analyze. And most of us have some combination. We straddle different domains, right? So that's just a little bit about those domains. So Aaron, talk to us in your work with students. How have you seen those domains at work, either in our staff that we work with or in these groups? And then Stacey, if you want to follow up with that from your perspective, that'd be great.
Yeah, thanks. I think to start from our staff perspective, we've worked together so long, which is awesome to be able to appreciate each other once we took the strengths assessment. And so seeing we have several members of our staff, we've got one that has context, which makes sense of the present based on what's happened in the past. And then you have another who has futuristic, who makes sense of the present based on the future, where if at the beginning we thought that might have been frustrating, but we can appreciate what they bring to the table. Like, oh, remember what we did in 2012? No, actually, I don't. You have context. This is what we did. And so being able to see what they bring to the table, where you just hit on that. Another staff member has WOO, which stands for winning others over. They want to be out front with people, and one that has includer, wants to include. So being able to appreciate from different perspectives, so the team can maximize efficiency, performance, and we can appreciate each other, where that could cause frustration at the beginning without that relationship or without knowing. It breeds appreciation when you own your strengths and can work together. So seeing that. Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things we've seen in our team is, so we have what we call a team grid, where we plot out, very nerdy thing to do, but all of our strengths, we kind of map it out. And so we're aware as a team, and this goes back to Stacey, what you were talking about, that I know for our team, our strengths primarily reside in the relationship building and executing. Kyle and I, we kind of lean on the strategic thinking quite a bit. But so there's two ways to look at that. One is you can say, and this kind of goes back to what you're saying, well, we don't have any influencing strengths, so we don't have any influence, right? But what we found is that our team is naturally wired and gifted to build relationships and get things done. We're not the biggest personalities, most of us, that are out there on campus, really getting things stirred up. But we'll build relationships with students. We'll call parents. We'll take care of them. If we say we're going to do some things, we'll make sure we get it done. And that's how we build influence. Does that make sense? So we may not have the strengths that say influencing, but we have the culture, right, that we can build around what we do have to make a difference.
Yeah, that's really well said. Yeah.
Yeah. So Stacey, for you, I mean, you want to jump in, or Tori, for you as well? Just
Well, I think from a different perspective is I've been talking with a lot of seniors lately, helping them prepare their resume. How do you talk about your strengths? So when you go into an interview, when they're asking you about your strengths, it's not necessarily what are you good at. I can do Word. Okay, how do we go beyond that? And so helping giving them the language of how they could fit on a team. Just like you said, you may not have all the strengths, but what can I bring to a team? And so helping them see their strengths as a tool to get a job or to look at the job market in a different way. And so becoming part of a team, we talk about team building, but becoming a part of a team is hard.
especially if you're new.
I'm the new kid on the block, right? So I'm like, oh, God. And now I need to find everybody's strengths.
By the way.
Thank you. I love it here. And so I think it's really important as we onboard people, like you do a great job with onboarding, helping us know, having those conversations so it stays top of mind, because it's not one of those assessments you take and you just put it away somewhere.
Right.
You need to actively really engage with the results so that you can be a good team player.
Yeah.
So one of the things I hear you saying in that, Stacey, is that like any team, no matter how healthy or even unhealthy, every team is going to bump into some conflict.
Will.
Yeah.
Let me tell you about conflict.
Yeah. So
It's a good thing.
It is a good thing.
Yes.
And how does this assessment, how does strengths like help us understand conflict as not a negative thing? I mean, there's some conflict that is negative, right? But like conflict is not always negative. Look no further than scripture to see that to be true. So how does it help us appreciate conflict?
Conflict is conflict in and of itself. It's just conflict. It's our behavior and our response to it. So as we know ourselves better and we know what our strengths are and those shadow sides, we can respond to conflict with a better behavior, with a better attitude. That's where most people, they blame conflict for an issue, and it's our heart response.
That's good.
It's our attitude to what we don't agree with. It's good to disagree. That's where we find growth and we learn things about ourselves and other people.
Yeah. I think one of the things for our team that's really helped is a lot of times conflict in a team setting is personality based,
Yeah.
right? It may be differences, but a lot of times it's because we're wired differently. And I think when a team can move from a place of frustration to appreciation around conflict, that's a huge step. It doesn't mean that it goes away, right? It doesn't mean that you resolve every single conflict and everybody's just singing Kumbaya all the time.
I wish that'd be nice.
I know, but I think, for us on our staff, we're all wired differently. And when I have the language and a framework for saying this person is wired differently and they actually make us better, and they're different than I am, and not only is that okay, but it makes us better as a team. That's such a healthy step to resolve conflict, because it's not about who wins, right? It's not about who's better. It's about Stacey's different, Aaron's different, Tori's different. We're on the same team. So rather than, and we'll talk about competition here in a minute, rather than competing, it just gives us a language of appreciation that just helps to mitigate or work through conflict, right? So much better, because we can learn to appreciate that people are different. And that's okay.
So let's maybe each dive into the archives here for a moment. Go way back. Come up with an example, a real life example that you've been a part of. Obviously, we will exclude names. But like an example where you've seen this play out, this whole idea of conflict being good, and based on our strengths, how you see those really helping give us a language. What's an example that's maybe hot off the press for you, or maybe not so hot off the press, maybe digging way back in the archives, where you've just seen this come to play in real life? Because we're talking about a lot of concepts and a lot of theories, but like, let's talk practical here for a second. What are some examples even in your own leadership in your own life that you can think of? I know that's a tough one.
Well, I just said one thing that popped to the top of mind. It's probably been, Ben will remember this when I start telling the story. It's probably been, 7-8 years ago, maybe. So we talk about all of us having the responsibility, strength, and the ability to take on. So there was something that I was helping oversee that I thought it was my sole responsibility to take on everything. And part of the lack of growth at the time was I was trying to do it all on my own and not asking for help, because I thought, oh, my name's attached to it. I'm supposed to be responsible. I'm supposed to oversee all of this. And they said, nope. The next thing that happened, they said, okay, this time you can't do anything with it. You need to take a step back and let the team help. And so that was an area of awareness to see that. I had to apologize to the team, because I was like, hey, sorry, team, I wasn't relying on you. I was being selfish. And we weren't as efficient. And so when you operate out of a place of trust with a team and celebrating each other's strengths and knowing that they're like, hey, I know you want to do well, you have responsibility. We need to rely on the team to do this. This is a team effort. We're all in this together. And so doing that helps better support. But I had to learn a hard lesson there to be able to rely and be at our best. So Oku could be at our best in that sense.
We have a team member, and I won't name names, but because it's really a positive story. But one of our team members has, and Aaron alluded to this earlier, has high futuristic and high ideation, which means that this person, who is a phenomenal leader, we always joke that they live in possibility land. Right? It's always, what if we could, because they're always about where things are going, making sense of the present. And ideation is about possibility. They just think they have ideas all the time. It's part of what makes them so great. We have another leader who's got context, which really values the past, thinks about the past, makes sense of the present through the past, and analytical, which is really about, give me the data, give me the raw data. I don't need the feelings. Just give me the data. Right. So you have a staff member who thinks about the past quite a bit and wants the data, and you've got one that's thinking about the future and possibilities. And you can imagine the conflict they're in, right? But what StrengthsFinder has done is to say, look, when this context person and analytical, when they speak, we better pay attention, because most of the time they're right, and they remind us, and we better not forget. Right? But when you have this other staff member who's got futuristic and ideation, they help to propel us or pull us into the future. And sure, there's conflict sometimes, but man, they are both so valuable on our team to make us better, right? We call one, the futuristic is the map maker, and the context is the map reader.
And you
right?
need both.
You need both, right? But without strengths, you don't have the language for appreciation and navigating some of those times. It's good.
Do you have a story? Stacey?
Brief. As a leader and having achiever, number one, with learner is I thought everybody on the team that I was leading was going to achieve with me and how I wanted them to achieve. And so just being very driven, responsibility, all of those things, it was really hard earlier in my career to help find out how do I motivate people who have different strengths, who need to think longer. And I'm like, here's all the data. I just showed you all the data. Let's. They're like, no, I need to think about it. And so as a young leader, just really, I think strengths and experience is really crucial. As you alluded to that earlier, it's like, years ago versus where we are now. And so I've taken strengths about 10 years apart almost. And just to see there's a little bit of movement, but I think it's more the growth and experience piece to that. But how we apply that. And so as a more mature leader, now I'm more conscientious. How do I get people to want to achieve? And it looks differently.
Yeah.
This is a little off script, but you talk a little bit about taking it over time, because this is an assessment that in theory you really could take multiple times, and you do see maybe some changes. So for those of you here at this table that are not me, but y'all are the experts on StrengthsFinder, talk to us just a little bit about kind of the science of it, because there is some logic to the fact that at a certain point in life, you're not necessarily set in your ways. I don't want to imply that language, but things are pretty much set within your top 10 or 12, I think is the number. So talk to us just a little bit about like what that age bracket looks like, because we might have some people listening today that are like, this is a brand new conversation. StrengthsFinder is very unfamiliar. So talk to us just a little bit about that. Let's maybe go back just a little bit on this.
Let me start then. Aaron, so you're certified as well, and Stacey, we'd love to hear for your experience. And then, Gallup has put together kind of a spectrum of products for this. So they actually have an assessment for kids
Very cool.
that's much more simplified, but it gives them a kind of a basic understanding. So a lot of the research now is personality is fairly dynamic. In other words, it can fluctuate a little bit until you're about 25, 26 years old now, right? That's kind of when you're emerging out of adolescence now, which we could talk about that some other time for our college students into late adolescence. But what the research would then say is once you get to that age, your top 10 or 12 are probably fairly stable as far as that they're there. But what we find is our strengths can shift around according to the context that we're in. So just because you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 doesn't mean that they lead that way, right? So I would imagine for Stacey that if she's in an environment where you have to make quick decisions to keep things going, that strategic is going to climb the ladder, right? Whereas if she's having coffee with a group of friends, that connectedness might climb the ladder, and so they can shift around in order. So Aaron, I don't know, or Stacey would welcome any other thoughts you have on that piece of it there, but that's kind of some of the research behind it.
Yeah, you referenced where they can as you get older, depending on where you are, they can shift. Like your top 10 can kind of shift around. The odds of your top 10 moving to your bottom 10, that's not likely going to happen, but focusing in on those, how they shift. And I also heard it said this way: if you think of your strengths like a deck of playing cards on situational, I'm going to use my consistency strength here. I'm going to use my empathy strength here, and part of using it depending on the situation. So some people will have different strengths that may seem like opposites. They're not necessarily opposites. It's a different perspective way of seeing that. And so a next step could be, if you've taken the top 5, maybe unlocking your full 34 if you continue to work in it and in using that. So I think it's a good next step after you've taken your top 5.
Let me ask you this question, Aaron, and you mentioned this earlier, but how does strengths help in a team setting to avoid things like competition or jealousy, or because that's our tendency, right? You mentioned being new in a team, and we're like, well, man, Tori's so much better, and we start to kind of compete or compare, so talk to us just how the assessment helps us to overcome or mitigate some of that comparison or competition that's so easy to engage in a team.
Yeah, I think in social media has some positives, but it also has some negatives of comparison of those things. But as you appreciate and learn to accept and understand how God has wired you, then there's more confidence in that and less comparison and focusing on what you don't have or what somebody else has. If you're confident and content in how God has made you and embrace that, like there's a lot of times where, you and I have talked to where the strengths drive me crazy right now. I really wish I had more strategic thinking strengths because they're all at the bottom for me. But if I lean in, and you've done a great job of encouraging, nope, you need to, you're relational, lean into those things. But really embracing what you do well will kind of help mitigate the competition of needing to be like somebody else. And that really helps breed appreciation and helping the team function. Because if they're constantly combating each other of being jealous, you're not going to be as efficient of a team and high functioning as a team as you could be.
So let's have a little bit of fun for a second. Take your top 5, both of you, for a moment. I can't remember all of them off the top of my head, so we might have to revisit these. But let's say you're working together on a team.
Yeah.
How do you two work together, given your strengths and this culture and the spirit of appreciation, what you just talked about? How do you leverage those strengths that you possess in appreciating the other person? Let's just get real practical here for a moment.
So it might be helpful to just
Revisit those 5.
top 5,
Yeah.
and then let us know what you would know about working with that other person.
Yeah. Would you like to start?
Sure.
Okay.
So my top 5 are learner, achiever, connectedness, responsibility, and strategic. Nice. So this is how we would start. Get to know each other.
Yeah. So learner, achiever, connectedness, responsibility, and strategic. Those are good ones.
Good.
That's true. There is no
Answer.
Yeah. For the listeners, there is no wrong answer. There's no wrong. There's so many different combinations.
bad strengths.
There's no bad strengths. Mine are empathy, harmony, consistency, developer, and belief.
So you're both leading the team. Let's just imagine this for a moment, given what you now know about the other. How are you leading, knowing what you now know about your colleague?
We're definitely going to lean into his ability to have strong relationships and understand empathy with who we're leading. Because if we can't do that first, we can't really have them achieve and be strategic. So I think we would definitely go there first to know the people, know their why, back to motivation, know their why, and then we can set up a plan. That's my strategic mind.
There you go.
That's good.
Right.
That's good.
It's good.
And I'll kind of go from the other perspective because strategic best idea wins is kind of how that I look at that strength, and where you have so much leaning in on your strategic learner, both of those together of, okay, there's so many different paths and you're going to know the best path forward. So we're going to lean into that, and your achiever strength and responsibility, you'll help bring the team around with that, that strength. And then your achiever, you're going to have that inward motivation. Hey, we're going to get this done. We're going to do this together, and you're going to have the best idea. So that's leaning into who you are and doing that. So that's when she said her strength. That's why I said those are good, because that's just the way to go about those. And so I think leaning into for each person what they're naturally good at and helping them see that. And so leaning who they are and not trying to focus on what they don't have.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. Let's play another game.
Ooh.
You want to?
Yeah, let's do it.
So I'm going to give you a statement, and I want you to tell me basically true or false, whether you agree or disagree with this. Okay, and then you can unpack that a little bit. So your strengths don't tell you what you should do. They tell you how you best make things happen, right? So your strengths don't tell you what you should do. They tell you how you best make things happen. True or false? Agree or disagree? And give us a little bit more on that. Stacey, we'll start with you. I'll pick on you first.
I would say true.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. So it's more a guide. Yeah. They don't tell us how to act or how to respond, because that's the shadow side. So we don't always respond correctly. Sometimes with personality, you mentioned earlier, and so I would agree that it's more of a guide, but it's not going to tell us. Everybody's looking for what's the answer, what's the easy answer, and strengths aren't the easy answer. They're really if you want to think about the boundaries, the guides, our decision-making process and our behavior process.
Yep. The way that I picture it, I was talking to somebody about this earlier today, is it's kind of like your leadership toolbox.
Yeah.
And you got these strengths that are really your tools.
Yeah.
Right.
So whatever the challenge is that you're facing, whatever the project is, this is what you carry with you to be able to tackle,
And the more you know about self, the more you know what tool
absolutely.
to pull out in the moment that you need it.
Right.
Yeah.
Aaron, what about you? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would agree with both statements. It's not necessarily for job placement. It's not going to tell you what you do, but how you go about doing something. We just talked about that, how Stacey leads and the way I lead and the way you guys would lead, you'd come at it from a different lens, like
Yeah.
different set of glasses, which is good. There's no right or wrong way to go about it. The way you go about it, how you go about it is different.
Yeah.
And so to me, that's so encouraging, and that helps our students know, like, hey, look, it's not like you're having to figure something out. You're leaning into who you naturally are. And we want to help come alongside you and help enhance that.
Yeah.
And be aware of that.
Well, and that's part of what we love about what we do at Oku, right? So regardless of if it's a business major, or if it's a ministry major, if it's a nursing major, having this assessment that we can sit down and say, look, this is the way God has wired you. And you don't have to be like this other person. This is you and your unique capacity.
We can celebrate that.
Yeah, right? And so if you're going to be a pastor, man, what great gifts to bring into the ministry. If you're going to be a nurse, what tremendous gifts to bring into healthcare. If you're going to be in business or education, whatever it's, and that's part of why this is so valuable for our campus here and our whole community, is because it just helps, it gives us language to speak into what God has gifted people to do,
Yeah.
right? Which is incredible.
So I'm curious, let's just talk to some leaders for a moment here that might be listening. What advice would you give them if they're wanting to maybe implement this tool, or maybe even other resources like this, to help understand their teams, to help understand how maybe they themselves lead? What advice would you give them, just kind of centered on today's conversation?
I was going to say, I'll let you go first.
okay.
Because I'm going to give what not to do.
Okay, I love it. I love it.
Okay. I'd say starting by spending time with your team, like leaders, if they have teams, to spend time with them, with the members of the team, to see, to helping celebrate, to foster, to create that trust, to see what is needed, and if they take the strengths assessment, to see how they're wired, but how their team is wired, so you can breed appreciation, to do that first, because if you just start out by, maybe for lack of a better term, barking orders, or if they know that there's no care or no trust there, then they may not be as willing to go the extra mile. But starting by developing relationships, even if they're not normally that way, I think by, if they lean in on strategic thinking, what is the best way to go about doing this? And so everybody, it's not like, hey, I need to be a certain type of leader. There's no one right way, one definition. There's millions of different ways.
That's good. So tell us what not to do then, Stacey.
Well, I think that the same is true, is if you have your employees take this assessment, but you don't dig into it. So you just get your top 5 and you have the language, but you don't dive into how do those work together? What are the shadow sides? How do we implement them? How do we put them on a grid and look at them as a team? And I think that's where we kind of sometimes can miss the mark. Like I said earlier, if we just, okay, great, I did that, check it off, I put it away. It's not a tool that you're actually using and developing and getting strengths coaches to come in and work with teams. Because sometimes it's hard if you don't have that background to really unpack the language. You have language now, but how do you unpack it and begin to utilize it well?
Utilizing it well without weaponizing it too, right? Because
Right.
that's the other temptation.
That's true.
Where you now have all this information about the people you work with, and then you use it as a means to justify, oh, that's the way that they are, like, obviously. And sometimes I think the temptation with different self-assessments is that we use it as either a weapon or a crutch. How do we get beyond that? How do we see it for the good that it actually can produce, without using it to justify our own actions or even box people into a corner? A boss I used to work for would say that, like, we will use these assessments so long as they don't pigeonhole us. So how do we get beyond that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think one of the benefits of strengths is there's a fantastic book out there called The Infinite Game. I've talked to you about this. Simon Sinek, really, really good book. But leadership is infinite, right? We never arrive as lead. We never arrive in marriage. We never arrive in faith. But we want to build cultures that are sustainable. And I think this is part of why this assessment is so beneficial, is because you never exhaust. Right?
Yeah.
You never arrive at a place where, like, yep, I've got my top 10 strengths. They're good to go, right?
Yeah.
And the same with the team environment. You never exhaust, and it creates such a healthy conversation to continue to keep growing.
Yeah.
Because results are important, but culture matters more.
For sure.
If you build the right culture, the right leadership culture that are aimed towards the results, you get both, right?
Right.
But sometimes if we just chase results, it can create a lot of chaos or dysfunction for the
sure.
team.
for sure.
Yeah. So, Stacey, let me ask you one more question, and then we'll kind of wrap this up here pretty quick. So, I think, and you've been in high level leadership for quite a while. One of the temptations I know for all leaders is we can become sort of myopic in leadership. And what I mean by that is we automatically assume, sometimes without even thinking about, that my team or employees see things the way that I do.
Right.
Or they're going to respond the way that I would, or they're going to have the same knowledge that I do. So how can an assessment like Strengths, if I'm a leader, help me to work through being able to see that maybe people see things different than I do, and that's okay? Can you speak to that just a little bit?
I think so. I think there's also, we talk about corporate culture, but there's also geographical culture and mindset and belief systems that play into how do we help people be successful and not make assumptions. Because we can be speaking the same language or thinking we have the same language, but there could be nuances of context and application. And so I think as leaders, it's really important to really dig that relationship we talked about earlier and that trust. And it's a continual process. Like you said, it's going to be ongoing in order to be successful. And there are other assessments like the 360 tool where you really get information from other people in other work groups in your team, beyond your team. And so always having that ability to see beyond, I think keeps us from being myopic. And if we're willing to take some criticism or willing to hear things we may not want to hear as a leader, then we're able to adapt and change and be more successful.
That's great. That's great.
So one of the things that we like to do as we end all of our conversations, no matter the topic, is to land on an uptick, a bit of an up and to the right. And so we like to talk about hope, because if we as believers aren't the most hopeful people in the world, then what are we doing, right? And so in light of today's conversation, and your answer doesn't even necessarily have to tie in Strengths or StrengthsFinder, but what's giving both of you hope right now? Aaron, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I was actually having coffee with a buddy this morning, and he's talking about values. And one of the things that we were talking about is just leaning in on honor, that everybody's created in the image of God. They have value because God's given them value. And so right there, like, that gives hope. That because of that, you could speak hope, you can encourage, and Strengths speaks to that on focusing what you do well. And listen, you have value. You're made in the image of God. He's made you, designed you a certain way, and you can honor him by being that, by being who he created you to be. And so leaning in on that honor and that image really, really helps as encouraging. It was encouraging for us this morning at coffee, and that's what we want to see in our students here. It's not just a transactional relationship. We want to send them out 1 cent. They're transformed. We want to see them grow and speak that life into them to go live for Jesus. And so not just here, but when they leave as well. And so that's
giving you hope these days.
That's giving hope.
Good.
Yep.
How about you, Stacey?
As we get closer to graduation, it really is. I'm so hopeful and ready for the future to see what our students are about to achieve, because they're coming into the office like, I got that job and I got this job. My life's about to start. I'm going to use these tools. And just to see the hope in their eyes, it's just a moment. And I'm like, God, please don't ever let me take this for granted, that we're investing in the next generation. And that just has such a ripple effect. And so I get teary, get weepy, because I'm so excited to see the students that are graduating from Oakwood that are well-rounded, that have been developed by multiple leaders with one path, with one focus on what God's called them to do.
Yeah.
It takes a team to do that. The work that we do, we don't go it alone, and that's good news. Grateful for both of you and the role that you play on Team Oakwoo. Grateful for this conversation. It's been good, very helpful. Yeah, I've learned a lot from all of y'all today.